And we're live. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the great debate. Not a debate where both sides work to defeat one another, rather, a debate where both sides come together to find common ground. Today, I'm stepping down from my position as a moderator, and I will join as a debater with none other than a friend of mine, Bassam. Bassam is a Palestinian educator and activist. He has an awesome podcast called, hold on, I don't have it open in front of me. Bassam, it's PreOccupation. What's it called?
PreOccupation, a not-so-brief history of Palestine.
PreOccupation, a not-so-brief history of Palestine. You see, as I'm not the moderator today, obviously I forgot to open up my my opening notes, but it's a fascinating podcast that I actually listened to. I haven't listened to all the episodes yet, but I've learned a lot from. Bassam and I have been going back and forth on Instagram the past few months, having some lively discussions on many different topics. We figured let's bring it public, let's bring it live. So Bassam, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'd like to just open by saying Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Before I actually get into before we get into everything that I want us to discuss today, I want to recognize that I'm speaking to you from Western Canada on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish First Nation. Today is Canada Day. It is the day that Canadians celebrate their independence. But in Canada, today is a day of national mourning because just yesterday and on several different occasions of the last 30 days, we found several mass graves of Indigenous children at the site of what were formerly residential schools. And the residential schools were an expression of this country's genocide inflicted upon this country's Indigenous people. And so if we do have an opportunity to speak about that at the end, I know it's not the subject that we were going to cover today, but I felt that that was very important to share with viewers who may not know Canada's history with ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Sure, yeah, thanks for sharing that, Bassam. Before we get into the topics, just a quick shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy PTY Ltd, SOG Cannabis, Max Marine, Geffen Posner, Adam Becker, Maya, and our one and only champion member, Raja. If you want to support the show and become a patron or support us in any other way, you could find links in the description. And if you want to get in touch with Bassam or find his podcast, also that will be in the description. So we're going to start with the topic of normalization. This is a topic that's come up a bunch in the past on the show, but this is an area where I think we'll have some disagreements, and we'll let the conversation flow from there. So you want to share, what is normalization and what your stance on it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Adar, I think this probably is the fundamental disagreement between you and I, because in the conversations that we have had, you've made it very clear that Palestinian liberation is something that you are very passionate about, that you think is a just cause. It underpins a lot of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. You recently had a debate, that British gentleman, I can't remember his name.
Joseph Cohen.
Yeah, about the Nakba, about ethnic cleansing. And really, when you say normalization, what I think that you mean is reconciliation, which is one part of a two-part formula, usually combined with truth. Truth and reconciliation usually come together. Let me park that for a second and maybe give you, share with the viewers a little bit about the underpinnings that formulate my worldview. And this will help explain why I stand where I stand on the subject of normalization. So a nation at its core, and listeners of my podcast will know because I've spoken about this a lot. A nation at its core is a story. It is a national narrative. It is a story that the adherents of that nation share about themselves and the institutions within it. A nation a nation is a story that combines a common understanding of the past and the present and a common vision for the future. A state is an institution, specifically at its core, an institution that possesses a monopoly on violence. That is the core of what a state is. All other manifestations of the state, healthcare, education, transportation, those are all secondary and tertiary. The fundamental purpose of the state is to monopolize violence. The point where the nation and the state fuse to form the nation state is when the state becomes the outward manifestation of the ethos of the nation. So it is the point where the state symbolizes, adopts, and projects elements of the national story in its quest to monopolize violence, deliver education, healthcare, all of those things. First of all, did that make sense?
Yep, perfect sense.
It all makes sense up here. So Zionism at its core, whether we are talking about political Zionism or practical Zionism, or whether we work into the 20th century and we focus on revisionism or labor Zionism, or across the spectrum, Zionism consistently applies a principle of Jewish supremacy and in some cases Jewish chauvinism in the land that the Zionists recognize as the land of Israel. So in this case, we're talking about between the river and the sea. We're talking about historic Palestine. Zionists view this as a natural thing, Jewish supremacy and Jewish chauvinism. And consequently, the state institutions that came out of the state of Israel all express that in various ways. At a municipal level, in urban planning, of course, in the state instruments of coercion, like the police and the military, in the economic structure, in the incentive structure. I am opposed to normalization because while that apparatus continues to exist, while that state continues to express Jewish supremacism and Jewish chauvinism, the best case that could come out of normalization for the Palestinians, and by normalization, I mean reconciliation. The best case is perhaps a slightly improved status quo where Palestinians are still viewed as strangers in their own land. And so in my personal activism, if I was going to divide my time, I'm about 95% focused on truth and 5% focused on reconciliation. In fact, the only conversations I have about reconciliation are with you. I don't have those conversations anywhere else, but I have a lot of conversations about truth.
Okay, yeah. So I think this definitely touches on some fundamental disagreements. First of all, I do recognize what you're saying. I understand why it's hard for Palestinians to accept a state that is Jewish in its nature on land that they have been living. I very well recognize that if the roles were reversed, we wouldn't have accepted such a state. That being said, to me, it seems like there's a zero-sum thinking that is very much at the core of Palestinian activism, which I feel ultimately is going to cause harm to Palestinian liberation. Not only is going to cause harm, but has caused harm. So, and again, it's not that I don't recognize where this rejectionism comes from. It's that I don't see how trying to dismantle institutions and essentially dismantle the Jewish state is going to open Jews up to hearing the Palestinian struggle and to thinking that we can live peacefully with Palestinians on this land. It seems like the more Jews have to fear, and let's not even say Jews because there's diaspora Jews, I don't want to speak for them, but the more Israelis have to fear, the more our back is up against the wall, the less empathetic we are towards the struggle of the Palestinians. So as much as I understand why partition was rejected in 1948, I think one of the fastest ways forward for Palestinian liberation today is for Israelis to feel safe and secure in their homeland. And the less safe and secure they feel, that seems to me that it's going to come at the expense of Palestinian liberation and just Palestinian well-being in general. So when you say you look more at truth than reconciliation, I would say for me, I look at it as effectiveness of activism, right? How can we find in an approach that is ultimately effective, um, something that's viable, something that's practical? So if it comes down to dismantling Israel, I mean, if 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 activists want to continue to try that, I mean, by all means, but I think that that is more likely to cause more Palestinian suffering than more Israeli suffering. Us having the upper hand, us feeling like this is our only place, it's the only Jewish state. We waited 2,000 years to return to this land. So it doesn't seem like that's an approach that ultimately is going to liberate Palestine. It seems to me like it's going to do the opposite. And this is because I support effectiveness, reconciliation, allowing both nations to feel comfortable with one another. Um, Allowing us to begin to see the humanity in each other and learn our narratives and our grievances seems to be one of the best ways forward in order to achieve Palestinian liberation.
So, Adar, I just want to say, and I'll disclose to the listeners that I've been watching your channel for some time before we connected, and I do believe that you're genuine in what you say, in your interest in seeing Palestinians liberated in their own homeland, and again, I think our disagreement is more about the road to get there rather than our opens. Having said that, let's look at the empirical evidence and let's see if what you're saying actually adds up. The original Zionist settlers, right? So we're actually talking about proto-Zionism, right? We're talking about the practical Zionists who arrived in like the Belu movement, and even into what's called the first Aliyah in 1882. They were not anti-Arab, okay? They did not come with a hatred of the Arabs. They were not anti-Arab the same way that you are not anti-palm tree. They saw the Arabs as part of the landscape. They are natives. Yes, I made the reference on purpose. They saw the Arabs as part of the landscape. This Arab will not notice if we pick him up from Haifa and we drop him in Basra in Iraq. He's not going to notice the difference. You read their writing. This is very much consistent, and this is very much consistent with settler colonial projects of the time. That attitude toward Palestinians persisted for a very long time in Zionist thinking. For a very long time, there's a reason why within 1948 Palestine, within Israel proper, within the Green Line, use whatever terms that you want. There's a reason why you refer to your Palestinian population as Israeli Arabs and not as the more recent term that I've seen adopted, Palestinian citizens of Israel. The reason for that is because people like Menachem Begin, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, they didn't recognize that there was such a thing as a Palestinian. And they told that story, said that these are just Arabs. They just belong in this place or that place. Okay, now without going on too long of a rant, because I actually want to answer the question that you were addressing, when do you think that changed? There was a finite point in the history of this struggle where that changed. And it changed in the first Intifada. The primary outcome of the first Intifada, if you were going to say, like, what was the main thing that came out of, what was the main concession, I'll call it a concession, what was the main thing that Palestinians gained out of the first Intifada was the recognition that Palestinians exist. because prior to that it didn't. And the Intifada was a civil rights struggle. It was a largely non-violent movement, but it was loud and it was disturbing, and it broke with the status quo. And so, by contrast, Oslo onward. So from Oslo, you could say from Oslo to today, but let's look at the years between, let's say Oslo to today, where the path to something that resembles normalization at a state and diplomat level. This is what Bishara Doumani and Rashid Khalidi call the suit and tie phase of Palestinian history. What happened? What happened between 1993 and 2005 was that more settlements in the West Bank were built in those years than between 1967 and 1993. So I look at normalization like this. Suppose that I was living in, my dad was born in Mukhayyam al-Am'ari, in the Am'ari refugee camp in Ramallah. Suppose that I was living there. Or even better, suppose that I was living in Sheikh Jarrah. And you, Adar, come to me and you say, look, let's eat hummus together, let's hang out. You recognize that I should be able to live in Sheikh Jarrah. I recognize that you, Bassam, should be able to live in Yafa, where you are ancestrally from. And I say, you know what? Okay, I recognize this. Adar, do you have the capacity, the means to be able to live in the West Bank? By hook or by crook, do you have that capacity?
Yeah.
One way or another, right?
Yeah.
You do. So I say, okay, great. Adar, ahla wa sahla, welcome. Welcome to Daf al-Gharbiyya, welcome to Sheikh Jarrah, welcome to Silwan, wherever it is. Okay, now get me into Yafa. I want to go to my ancestral homeland. You then will return to the state instruments of coercion that have Jewish supremacy at the core of their DNA. And you will say, hey, I want my friend Bassam to come live in Yafa. And they'll say, you're out of luck because that guy's not coming here. By the way, this is owned by the Jewish National Fund. It's against our bylaws for him to live here anyway. You come back to me and say, hey, Bassam, sorry, no luck. And I say, but you're here now. Well, this is not fair. Now you need to get out. And he said, whoa, you can't get me out now. This is ethnic cleansing. And so this is why that type of formulation does not work, because there is a power imbalance wherein you can get your way through normalization. I don't just mean you personally, Adar, but I mean the Jew, the Zionist, the Israeli can get their way, but the current power dynamics prohibit me from getting anything out of that equation other than that you and I get to have a nice conversation. It is what Ghassan Kanafani called a conversation between the sword and the neck.
I hear you. I do think something can come from the conversation, though. I think that currently, if we look at how Israelis prioritize, hold on, there's a car. Get out of here. If we look at how Israelis prioritize, like what's important to them, what affects who they vote for. Security is generally towards the top. Palestinian well-being is non-existent. And why? Because it's not necessarily, the majority of Israelis don't hate Palestinians. We just view them as our enemy who we need to defend ourselves from. And if we don't, we'll be killed. That's generally the framework. Obviously, fear manifests itself in many ways, and often hate as well. But we do not value the well-being of Palestinians, as we see them as our enemy who just wants to destroy us. If we were to have more contact with Palestinians, learn more from Palestinians about their struggle and their narrative, I think it would help put Palestinian well-being at a higher importance amongst Israelis. It's very easy to be indifferent to somebody who you don't know or somebody who you perceive as your enemy. But it's much harder to be indifferent towards somebody who you can call a friend, or at the very least an acquaintance. Israelis don't learn anything about Palestinian narrative. Well, we learn the parts that make Palestinians seem like they're just a fake nation who's just here to kill us, right? That's what we learn about Palestinians. We don't learn true Palestinian grievances. Palestinians, and again, I'm not saying Palestinians alone, this is the work of Israeli activists as well, but Palestinians have the great ability to educate Israelis the way you do. So when I say I can understand the anti-normalization to the extent that says we should not just pretend everything's okay. We shouldn't just sit and have hummus together, right? Because of this power imbalance. But we should engage in dialogue. We should be able to have these meetings, share our struggle, share our narrative, be the educators that are very much needed in order for Israelis to understand Palestinian grievances. So I view this as Israelis having the power, Israelis being the ones who actually vote for our leaders. If we can get Israelis to care about Palestinians, I think that has the ability to change how we view politics. So that's where I see a great benefit in us communicating with one another.
You know, on the so since we're still on the subject of normalization, there is a position that you could take on the subject of normalization, or rather anti-normalization, that can get to the point of absurdity, right? One story that I so Robert Fisk, late he died just mid 2020, I think. He was a foreign correspondent, wrote for The Independent, amazing journalist. And he shared a story about when he interviewed fighters from Hamas in southern Lebanon, in that brief phase where they were exiled into southern Lebanon. Some of the fighters asked him, some of the commanders asked him, "Where are you going to next?" And they said, he said, "I'm going to interview Shimon Peres." And they said, "Would you like his home phone number?" And what that story revealed was that on some level or another, a lot of these people communicate, but it's what they're communicating about that's different. So I am not going to take anti-normalization to its extreme and say that if a Zionist says hi to me in the street, that I'm going to walk away. I've never asked you, Adar, if you identify as a Zionist or not, but I'm talking to you, right? But it's what we're talking about that kind of changes the nature of the conversation. Now, the thing about communication that we've learned more than ever in the Trump era, we learned something really remarkable about communication. And that is the beauty of the echo chamber. And that is the reality that I can actually talk to you and you might actually hear nothing. Like, I'm saying words in a language that you understand, but you're not actually hearing anything. If you want to see the echo chamber epitomized in this whole theater between the river and the sea, if you want to see it in one screen grab, it would be watching Israelis sit upon hilltops, watching Gaza get pummeled by the Israeli Air Force, and cheer and celebrate. They know there are human beings there, right? They know that. But the nature of the echo chamber is such that, well, let's look at let's look at some academic examples. Up until, like, I have hundreds of books all over my house. Up until something like 2005, 2006, historians in the United States, in Canada, by and large, unless they were Palestinian historians, they didn't use Palestinian sources. They thought of Palestinian sources of firsthand accounts as fundamentally untrustable. It's like a built-in racism to it. And you probably hear this all the time if you're debating with if you are debating with ardent Zionists and you're saying, "But you know, my friend Bassam says this." And I was like, "Come on, he would say that, right? Of course he's going to say that. He's an Arab." And so in the current climate, where the power imbalance is so lopsided, I'm skeptical of the impact of, even if every Israeli knew a Palestinian. You had, I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, so I'll wrap this up. In one of the debates that you had on Sulha, there was a Israeli girl who said something, an Israeli woman who said something. I almost fell out of my chair laughing when she said, "You know, the the girl who threads my eyebrows in Palestinian, and that's how I know that Israel is not an apartheid state. And that is hilarious. That is like an American being like the Mexican who does my gardening. You know, he's Mexican. I'm not a racist, right? And the guy at my barber shop, he is black. America is not racist. It's hilarious. Absolutely oblivious. And so, in the current climate, where those state instruments of coercion continue to express Jewish supremacy in the way that they do, normalization, these conversations can only do so much. Also, keep in mind, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll let you stop hogging up all the oxygen. I, as effective as I may ever be, will never be able to compete with the Israeli education system. Like, I may get, let's say my podcast explodes to tens of thousands of listeners. I'm competing against a state-backed institution through which it is compulsory that every single Israeli child sits. I can't compete with that. Like, that propaganda machine is so much more effective than I will ever be. So I'm more inclined to try and transform the propaganda machine itself.
So, I mean, you do make a good point that even with these conversations, they're still competing with a propaganda machine. Israeli education doesn't go. Yeah, I guess if you were to hear it, you would view it as propaganda, but it's not like comparable to like North Korean propaganda or some other like truly authoritarian nations that really like drill in a national story from a young age. I'd say it's a little bit more liberal than that. But I do still see value because often we've seen that change has taken place outside of the institutions. So during the American Civil Rights Movement, and I know no example, like we could point to South Africa. Some people like to point to South Africa. Some people like to point to the Civil Rights Movement. No example we're going to use is one for one, but we could take certain instances to try to understand how power dynamics may play out. And the American Civil Rights Movement was Black activists also going against a white supremacist propaganda machine. And they didn't do it alone. It wasn't Black activists alone. It was Black activists very much appealing to white Americans, saying we should be equal. We're no different than you. And they were able to build a broad coalition of Black Americans and white Americans. And so that does give me hope that even with the state apparatus, you know, that instills in its citizens certain ideas, I don't think that means you can't change the hearts and minds of a population through real activism. I do think we're not so in opposition from one another when it comes to normalization ultimately, because I get what you're saying about the kumbaya, let's just pretend everything's okay. I don't oppose that. Like if I see Israelis and Palestinians being friends, like I'd be happy to see that. But I certainly will not tell a Palestinian you should go befriend an Israeli. Like it's not an expectation. So I think we are almost aligned there. I would leave it up to the Palestinian to decide what they are comfortable with. But I very much do believe that building these ties and building a coalition with one another, I think ultimately can have a great impact. And, you know, I also very much think that if Black Americans during civil rights movement, if their goal was to dismantle the United States, or maybe sometimes use harsher rhetoric, destroy the United States, I think they would have much less white allies. So again, this strengthens the notion for me that the activism will be more effective if we could build a coalition of Israelis and Palestinians. And Israelis are not going to get on board with a coalition that sees the destruction of their homeland. You may be under the opinion that, oh, well, then we'll do it alone. We'll do it with the international community. And so I'd actually like to hear from you. So you don't,
Yeah.
you don't think conversations can have a great impact. And I would actually agree with you. I don't think that's enough. I think the idealist in me says, if every Israeli had a Palestinian friend and every Palestinian had an Israeli friend, the conflict would be over. That's the idealist in me. But the realist in me understands that it's probably not so simple. It'll probably require some other means. So I want to hear from you what you think those means actually can be, what you'd like to see happen, and how we go about that.
So there is so much in there to unpack. For one, actually, the civil rights struggle had its own political spectrum. So if you read the writings of and about Martin Luther King, yes, I could see how you would leave with the impression that you left with. If you read the work of Malcolm X, you'd leave with a very different impression. If you read the works of the Black Panthers, so the civil rights movement was definitely a spectrum, but the white Americans who were on board with that also came to the realization that America needs to go a fundamental change. I would also argue that the civil rights struggle, similar to the Intifada, failed in that it took its foot off the gas too soon. Actually, they were able to get major concessions in the civil rights era, and then the state of race relations, frankly, stagnated in the United States up until very recently. So with that, let's talk about tactics and the subject of the international community. Palestinians recently have undergone a form of liberation, and a very important form of liberation, not from the Israeli occupation. Palestinians have been liberated from the shackles of false hope. Okay. Egypt is not coming. Erdogan is not coming. Imran Khan and Pakistan, they're not coming. Saudi Arabia is not coming. Nobody's coming to save us. And that is liberating because we can now recognize that other than Allah, we have no one. We don't have anybody to protect us. And in fact, as a Muslim, I find that exceptionally liberating because all other types of power, all other worldly types of power, are in fact illusory. They're an illusion that they are merely figments of our imagination. And this is liberating because it allows us to finally get to work, to know that nobody else is going to solve this for us. And this is a problem that Palestinians have struggled with since the 1920s. Believe it or not, in the 1920s, British and French intelligence believed that Mustafa Kemal's army was going to be marching into Homs in no time. He's going to come, trample through Syria. The French were not prepared for him. And so the French made a separate deal. His army stayed in Anatolia. The French stayed in Syria. Crisis averted. So we learned at that time, Mustafa Kemal is not coming to save us. And with that, I actually find that to be uplifting. I know now that we can only rely on Allah to save us from the situation that we're in. I do not rely on the international community to do anything. And the biggest gains that Palestinians have been able to make from 1948 until now have all been at grassroots level activism. As far as how Palestinians should move forward, look, if an individual Palestinian wants to invite a settler into his house and say, look at how I live, look at these conditions, look at how I have no water, look at how your settlement has blotted out the sun, look at all of this. If he wants to do this, I'm not going to stop him. But I will not take an a priori position to tell Palestinians to let down any means of resistance. All means of resistance in any either civil rights struggle or liberation struggle must be kept on the table. none of them should by default be taken off the table. So even if there are some conversations that are happening on the person-to-person level, even if there are diplomatic conversations happening, even if BDS is a lot, all of these things should be happening in tandem. We should never sacrifice any of the cards that we have to play, because at the end of the day, that we are the weaker party. So we need all of the cards that we have.
I'm on mute. Yeah,
There
I
you
was
go.
on mute. I actually agree. I agree with most of what you said. I think faith in the international community should not be had. More often than not, the international community does not come in and help oppressed people. There's only probably a few instances where they have, and in recent times, very close to none. So I would say that is a good realization. When it comes to I guess you view things in more of like an Islamic lens. I'm more agnostic, but what I would say is, and maybe this is just a semantic difference, no one but Allah. The way I view it is no one but ourselves. But is that an unnecessary semantic difference between us empowering ourselves and but by the will of Allah, us having the ability to do it?
Well, one principle that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree on is that God helps those who help themselves. So
Okay.
you're not far off.
Okay. Sounds good. All forms of resistance being on the table. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't tell a resistance movement what they can and can't do. We were often in a weaker position, and we did what we needed to do to fight back. That said, I do view certain forms of resistance as far more effective, and I certainly understand why we are viewed as colonists to Palestinians. Not only, when we came here, we called ourselves colonists. We had the Jewish Colonist
Colonization.
Association.
Yep.
Yeah. We had all these trusts and associations that were named Jewish Colonist Association. So makes sense. Makes sense that we're viewed as colonists. To Palestinians, we're colonizers. I recognize that. But I think that there's something fundamentally different between us and most other colonies. It's that we very much belong to the land, just like Palestinians do, right? The idea of us packing up our bags and going home is not the same as British leaving India or French leaving Algeria. We're gonna live and die for this land. Not all. Some will say, you know what? If shit hits the fan, I'll find a way to immigrate to a different country. But it's in the millions of people who are willing to fight and die for this land. This is not just a regular colony of another country. This is an indigenous rights movement that used colonial tactics to achieve their goals, and their goals came at the expense of Palestinian national liberation. So I don't think just looking at it in terms of the colonized needing to fight the colonizers, that framework is going to necessarily work. And often that was done through violence, violent resistance until it was not worth it for them to live here. They're going to pack up, right? That's a very common anti-colonial tactic. I don't see that being nearly as effective with Jews living on the land. I view violence against Jews living on the land as only radicalizing them, only making them more fearful, more proud of their nation, more hateful towards Palestinians. Again, may I be wrong in my assumption? Perhaps. But based off what I know about the Israeli people and just about people in general, of what violence does to us, what trauma does to us, it seems like we should try to avoid violent resistance. While I will not even say, as you said, it should all be kept on the table. I understand that and respect that. But when I look at what will be most effective, I think violent resistance probably is not going to be what's going to help liberate Palestine. And I think it's more likely to do the opposite. Recently, we had I think Palestinians had the greatest moment of activism perhaps in the past 70 plus years. They did a general strike.
Hmm.
Palestinian citizens of Israel and West Bank Palestinians that work in Israel didn't show up to work. I don't know if it was for a day or a few days. That is powerful. I think that may have achieved more in one day than BDS has in their decade plus of operation. Again, I'm not saying don't have
Right.
BDS as an option. I just think that this form of activism, this is what we should be looking at. General strikes, we've seen them be effective.
Hmm.
Communicating, trying to build ties with Israelis. Again, doesn't need to be kumbaya ties. It could just be educating them, getting Israelis to care about the Palestinian struggle, having the Palestinian struggle be part of our political conversation amongst Israelis. I view these as ultimately the most effective forms of activism.
Um, so yeah, the conversation about effectiveness is very important. Um, Again, when I look at the last 100 years of Palestine's colonization, and it's funny, just while you were talking, I was looking at the side of the screen, and one guy was frantically scrambling. No, 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 no. That's not what they meant by colonization. They meant something else by colonization when they called themselves the Jewish Colonization Association. Look, Ze'ev Jabotinsky knew what they meant by colonization. When Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote his Iron Wall essay, he said, every native population resists a colonial project. That is what we are, and that is what this is. He knew exactly what was going on. And so the fear that you keep talking about is a really important part of this recipe. It's a really important part of this whole conversation. When Theodore Herzl was presenting to a British commission on what Zionism is, and he said that Zionism is a national movement. And he kind of explained the fundamental underpinnings. And he said, look, a nation is a people. I defined a nation as a story. He defined a nation as a people united around a common enemy. That was in Theodore Herzl's definition of a nation. And it's not a bad definition either. So it's not a bad one. But when they said, well, what is the common enemy here for the Zionist? Do you know what he said? Are you familiar with this? Do you know what he said?
No, I don't. No.
So no hesitation, not a moment's hesitation. And they said, like, this is Zionism, this is what the Zionist nation is, and this is what a nation is. And they said, what's the common enemy? He said, the anti-Semite. That is the enemy of the Jewish nation. At which point, had somebody asked, well, what happens if there's no more anti-Semitism? Theodor Herzl's response would have been, that's impossible. Because anti-Semitism is endemic to the human condition. Something that Theodor Herzl believed. Right, that the world was fundamentally built of Semites and anti-Semites, and by Semites he means Jews, right? Of Jews and anti-Semites. And living in the European environment that he lived in, look, I can totally understand how he came to that conclusion. But he did not feel that Europeans would ever be free of anti-Semitism. What Israel never lost that. Anti-Semitism is a fail-safe to the Israeli identity. It's like an immune system to change, so that any criticism that comes into Israel is immediately met with the charge of anti-Semitism. And for that to be possible, defining anti-Semitism has constantly had to change. We can probably agree that 1930s style European anti-Semitism doesn't exist in the world the way that it did in the 1930s. Can we agree on that? Like,
a lot of the same tropes still very much
yeah,
exist. It's
yeah,
just, I don't think you have any nation that is used those tropes to gain power and made the Jewish question as a focal point of a political
yeah,
campaign. That doesn't
yeah.
exist today.
Yeah. Okay. We are in total agreement. We're in total agreement. So all of the tropes, all of the subtle, all of the false forms of flattery of Jews are conniving and Jews are sneaky and Jews are smart, but all in this like mischievous way. Yes, it all exists on some level, but it's not manifested in the same way, right? But even if it didn't exist, even if it did not, if anti-Semitism has been at the core of your national story, Israel actually needs, it's this weird, frankly, kind of perverse reality where Israel needs this to be able to keep the nation together. And now anti-Semitism is embodied in the Palestinian, right? The Palestinian is the threat, to Jewish survival, even if we were not. One of the things that I've learned from your channel is that very bizarrely from my side of the fence, that a lot of Jews actually see themselves as the weaker party. They actually think that they're negotiating from a position of weakness. Like the fear that you're talking about is so many layers deep. And you've been living in Ze'ev Jabotinsky's iron wall for so long that you don't realize the position of strength that you're speaking from. It's remarkable.
It's largely due to the fact that we are a population that is just 2 generations from having half our population murdered and hundreds of years of persecution leading up to that. That's at least the Ashkenazi Jews, and the Mizrahi Jews leaving their countries in fear of being killed by their neighbors. So we're very much a traumatized population that sees ourselves holding on to this tiny sliver of land surrounded by enemies, right? So if you compare ourselves to the Palestinians, we recognize ourselves as having the power. But we don't view this simply as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We view it as an Israeli-Arab conflict.
Yep.
Not only Arab, but, Iran as well, right? So a Jewish-Muslim conflict. We're terrified of Iran having nuclear weapons one day. We have Hezbollah to the north with hundreds of thousands of rockets pointed to us. We have Hamas in the south with tens of thousands of rockets pointed towards us. We have relative peace with Jordan and Egypt, but no one trusts that when push comes to shove, that peace will last. So we do have the power, but it's not hard. It shouldn't be hard to understand given our history. And even given that we've almost lost wars in the past, like 72 Yom Kippur War, we were losing. We lost a lot of territory. If it wasn't for the help of the United States, we may not have survived. So we recognize how fragile and delicate what we have here is. That we very much the iron wall very much still exists. We are defending this tiny strip of land in a hostile region. Against people who have not been shy in their aspiration to destroy us. So I know this sounds crazy for a Palestinian to hear, because a Palestinian feels like they have, they live under the boot of an Israeli soldier. So I recognize that it's an interesting paradigm that it's not as simple as viewing it as weak versus powerful. It's true we have the power when it comes to Palestinians, but we don't feel like our existence here is so simple and so eternal. We see that we are in the potential for being genocided again if we don't take the right steps today to ensure our security on this land.
So let's go back to one of the things that I find in the research that I do. The chapter in Palestinian history that I find to be maybe the most fascinating, and the biggest question that I had when I really knuckled down in my obsession to understanding Palestine, was the early interactions between Palestinians and Zionists. So for their part, the Palestinians did not universally view Zionism as a unique threat to Palestine. Part of the reason for that was because there were other colonial projects going on. The Russians had settlements in Palestine. The Germans had settlements in Palestine. The Americans had a colony. The British had colonies. The French had colonies. This was something related to something called the Ottoman capitulations. It's another story. Maybe somebody will ask about it later. The Palestinians did not view the Zionists as a unique problem. However, within about 20 years of their arrival, they did recognize that the Zionists were a unique problem, that there was something peculiar about these people that was different. And actually what was different was Jewish supremacy. Because in the places where Zionists were buying land, by and large, they wanted to expel the indigenous population. The first case of expulsion that I saw, that I was able to find, was in a place called Khirbet Duran in 1892. The first one that I was able to come across. Prior to that, I can't find any documented from 1882 to 1892, but I found one in 1892. And they're consistent thereafter. There are cases of Fallahin being expelled from their homes from 1892, of course, all the way till 1948, right? Never ends after that. But with that, we have conversations between Theodore Herzl and Yusuf Ziya al-Khalidi. We have conversations between Eliezer Ben Yehuda and Ruhi al-Khalidi and Sa'ad al-Husseini. And one of the things that you find consistently from the Palestinian position in every single one of those cases, Yusuf Ziya, Ruhi al-Khalidi, and Sa'ad al-Husseini, who were Palestinian leaders in their own time, of all of them recognizing, or all of them saying in almost as many words, nobody denies the Jews belong in Palestine. Every single one of them said that in their either in their letter writing or in the interview that they had. And in some cases, they said, like Sa'ad al-Husseini, said, let them come by the thousands, even by the tens of thousands, but not to establish a state here, because there's already a people living here. Now, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who in his private writings had his own intentions, but comes back and says to them, but this is going to benefit you. There's going to be infrastructure projects and all these things. And anyways, they agree to disagree and they go on. But all of them make that initial recognition. Now, here's something really important to understand about pre-Zionist Palestine. Palestine sits at the mouth of 3 continents. And so with and Palestine has been continuously inhabited for 7,000 years. 7,000 years of continuous inhabitation at the mouth of 3 continents ensures, unsurprisingly, that you're going to develop some indigenous mechanisms to deal with the subject of diversity. It turns out that diversity is in and of itself indigenous to Palestine. And so, if an area that has developed indigenous mechanisms to deal with diversity has a severe case of rejection of one particular colonial project, what does that tell you about that colonial project? Now, one could say, well, no, they rejected the Jews because they're anti-Semitic. And I've heard this, right? They're willing, anybody else could come into Palestine, right? But they rejected the Jews because they were anti-Semitic. This is nonsense. Consider that, we talk about dealing with hard truths and guilt and uncomfortable realities. I identify very, very strongly in my Islamic identity, very strongly. And yet I have to cope with what I've learned about the Armenian genocide. Like I have to deal with that. I have to recognize that other people who call themselves Muslims, whether they killed 60,000, 600,000, 1.5 million, how many young girls have to be raped for me to be okay with it? What's the number? 10, 20? Like what is the, I don't have a minimum number. 1 is too many, right? One is one too many. And yet the Armenians who came, having been annihilated along the journey, made themselves home in Palestine, maintained their identity in Palestine, still view themselves as uniquely Armenian, and yet you have interacted with Armenian Palestinians who consider themselves just as much Palestinian as they are Armenian. We have we've always had indigenous mechanisms to embrace new communities. Maybe not in the numbers that the Zionists were looking for. Frankly, okay, there is a problem there. But there were always these indigenous mechanisms to deal with that. And it is the fact that Zionism came with a uniquely supremacist ideology that made that impossible. And you could see it as early as the turn of the 20th century.
So I agree with you very much so that the reason we were rejected was not because we were Jews. And I didn't speak to this, but you did say that Palestinians, the Israel kind of needs a boogeyman, and you said the boogeyman was anti-Semitism, and now Palestinians became the anti-Semites. And I do see signs of that. I don't think this is something intentional or explicit. I think it's just been like a natural manifestation of our discourse um, when it comes to the conflict. But it's true that most Jews today would say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, yet there's no reason why a Palestinian should be anything but anti-Zionist, given
Yes,
what Zionism means to them. Right.
right.
So I fully recognize that. I like to look at it as sometimes anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but not inherently. And often, I don't want to get too deep in that conversation, but it comes from different definitions of Zionism. When a Jew says Zionism, they're just saying it just means Jewish self-determination on our ancestral homeland. But Palestinians, when they say Zionism, they're talking about a Jewish supremacist state on their ancestral homeland. So how could they be okay with that? So it is important to understand that dynamic. And I fully recognize that my family moved to the land in 1812.
Right.
We lived in Hebron. We lived peacefully with our Palestinian neighbors for I guess over a century. Um, I think that what the Zionists should have done was to come to this land and try to build a binational state, right? Make a case to the people living here. Let's build a state together. We have resources from Europe. We could get the international community to support what we're doing. Let's have a Jewish Arab national homeland, whatever you want to call it. Again, would that have worked? I really don't know, but I think the chance of that being accepted by Palestinians would have been much greater than an exclusive Jewish state. That's for sure. But now, 100 years later, when we've been at conflict for a century, and there's so much either hate or fear or distrust between one another, the path to achieve a binational state will take many generations of us not fearing one another. If we were to move to a binational state tomorrow, and I know this is becoming the increasingly popular position that Palestinians take, they say, let's just have a binational state. But the reason why Palestinians are comfortable with that is because they recognize that they're going to eventually have a demographic majority, or at least be close. The worst possible thing is for us to share a state and for us to be competing over demographic control. That would end in disaster. A binational state would work when we don't care who has demographic majority, when there's no fear of being a minority in our land, right? But because both nations fear each other or hate each other, by a binational state, what perhaps could have worked 100 years ago and perhaps could work in 100 years from now, today would likely end in disaster. So I don't think that working towards that solution in the near term is viable or just. I think we should look at solutions that give both people sovereignty over a piece of land, both people autonomy over their respective areas, and it doesn't even need to be us here, you there. It could be on a neighborhood basis as well. There's many creative ways in which we could do this and work towards the goal of a binational state one day. So that's how I look at it. I definitely understand the sentiment. I get why Zionism was rejected in 48, and I understand why it's still rejected today. But I'm trying to really look at real practical solutions for what we could possibly do.
Um, so much to say, and I'm trying to wrap all of my thoughts into a coherent message. One of the more primitive creatures in the chat said that Bassam is okay with Jordan killing thousands of Palestinians, but not okay with Israel and what it does to the Palestinians. Both of my parents survived the Black September War, you imbecile. So if there's anything that I am familiar with, it is that chapter of Palestinian history. So just sit down, relax, smoke your vape, and just listen to the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, haters gonna hate.
So I guess I'm not as famous as you are, Adar, so I don't have to deal with this as much. So, but in any case, so look, the subject of a binational state is fascinating because it's not a new idea. Look, for all of the Jewish conspiracies out there, Zionism only ever had two superpowers. That's it, two. Number one, there were two things that made Zionists uniquely successful as a national movement. And were I not the victim of that national movement, I'd have more admiration for it as opposed to loathing. Number one, the Zionists had an unrelenting goal, which was an exclusively Jewish state. Okay. And number two, to achieve that unrelenting goal, they were willing to stack the deck. In the First World War, there were Zionists that fought for the Ottoman Empire. There were Zionists that fought for the British. There were Zionists that fought for the Germans. They bet on every outcome. At the end, whatever the outcome, the end result needed to be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, I don't want to oversimplify, and you could find calls for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine from the 19th century. They're there, right? I've shared some of them with you over. Anybody wants to see them, I can share them. But Zionism had an ebb and flow depending on what was happening in the world, and responded and adapted to the changes in the world as they saw fit. There was a long phase of Zionism from the 1880s all the way to 1914, which tried to work within the institution of the Ottoman Empire, right? To create a Jewish homeland within the Ottoman framework. There was a time in the 1908 Young Turk Revolution where Zionists were unsure. Do we want to adopt Ottoman citizenship, or do we not want to have Ottoman citizenship? And if we do, are we part of the Ottoman social fabric? Eliezer Ben Yehuda was one of the people who favored this. So there were opportunities for Zionists to pursue a more, as you've called it here, a binational arrangement. The problem was that the vast majority of Zionists wanted an exclusively Jewish state. This is the reason why they were expelling Fallahin. You know, if you read anything before 1917, so anything before British conquest of Jerusalem, anything before the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians had two major complaints about the Zionists. I don't know if I've ever told you this before, but you read it again and again and again and again. Two major complaints. Number one, these new Jews do not want to mix in the rest of the society. They want to stay secluded. Number two, and this seems silly, but it was a common complaint. Number two, they're not nice. They treat us with contempt. And Ahad Ham saw this. He saw that the Zionists were treating the Palestinian Fallahin with contempt. And he warned them that there is something simmering beneath the surface here. They're quiet for now, but eventually we're going to keep treating them like scum, and something's got to give. So Ahad Ham, of course, being a cultural Zionist, and anyways, I figure that you know who he is, and the listeners know who he is. And so with that at the core of Zionism, became very difficult. I go so far as to say nearly impossible for them to have allowed for a binational arrangement. And there are unique things within the Jewish experience that reveal to why they would have been resistant to that. When you're a diasporic community and you're constantly facing the threat of annihilation in your journeys around Europe, I understand that you may not want to mix with everyone else. You develop some social quirks, and yeah, okay, I get that. But there were numerous other opportunities for a binational state. There were calls for, there are, so what I'm getting to here is there are reasons why a binational state did not happen earlier. There was a time where the British and the Zionists were pushing the Palestinians for a binational state. This is maybe you know about and maybe you don't. They were pushing the Palestinian leadership for a binational state in 1918. And by a binational state, I mean one under British sovereignty. But it came with a condition: full acceptance of the Balfour Declaration. So this binational state still would have been a Jewish homeland that took 90% of the population and transformed them into the non-Jewish population, which of course was a non-starter. When the Palestinians came around to the idea of a binational state in the late 1920s that didn't recognize the Balfour Declaration in principle, and the British were on board for it, the Zionists rejected it. The Zionists actually always favored partition because, again, they preferred an exclusively Jewish state.
Wasn't it true, though, that Palestinians also rejected a binational state? They also weren't too on board with something like that. I believe it was the white papers that
the Peel Commission.
Was it the Peel Commission or was it prior to the Peel Commission?
Sorry, you're talking about partition, or you're talking about a binational state?
No, a binational state. I believe it was the what's the exact term? The white papers. It was in the 20s. It was proposed. Or am I messing up my dates?
Maybe. I don't believe there was the King-Crane Commission in the 1920s.
Oh no, it was 1939. No, my bad.
Yeah.
So okay,
yeah.
That was right after Peel.
Yeah. So the 1939 white paper is fascinating because after 3 years of Palestinians revolting against the British, that saw 1 in 10 Palestinian men dead, exiled, imprisoned, or wounded. Devastating counterinsurgency campaign run by Ord Wingate and the Black and Tan units. The British then went and conceded to every single Palestinian demand. Suddenly, right? Neville Chamberlain basically came out and said, halt to Jewish immigration, capped at 75,000 a year for 5 years, and then less than that thereafter. A Palestinian state, a binational state within 5 years, like basically agreeing to every single demand. By 1939, first of all, there is no Palestinian leadership anymore. It does not exist because it has been dismantled. Moreover, what remnants of the Palestinian leadership existed did not trust the British. Like it is always remarkable to me. I'm not, by the way, I'm not accusing you of doing this, right? But like when anytime this conversation comes up and a fact gets pulled out of a hat, depending on who's talking, sometimes they want to ignore the 3 years or the 30 years that immediately preceded it. But they did not trust the British. So the Palestinian leadership that did exist did not believe the British were actually serious, even if they were. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning is why did the British do? Is it because they suddenly had a change of heart? Is it because suddenly the British became nice? Because they felt that the indigenous inhabitants of this land deserve their rights? Had nothing to do with any of that. The reality was that throughout the Palestinian revolt against the British between 1936 and 1939, Italian and German propaganda was pumping stories of the massacres committed against the Palestinians in Cairo, in Damascus, in Algiers, all over the Arab and Muslim world. And with the clouds of war looming in the horizon, the British saw that they cannot antagonize the entire Arab world. Let's throw them a carrot.
That's fascinating. I actually didn't. I didn't know that little bit of history.
Mm.
I really appreciate these conversations with you because it's like it's a crash course on the history of the land.
I do this a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think we're in agreement about that there should have been an attempt to create a binational state. But let's talk about the present, right? Do you think is that what you'd like to see the solution today? Is that what you want to see the Palestinian resistance achieve a binational state from the river to the sea? What it's called, what the flag is is
Yeah.
less important. But is that what you're looking for? And do you really
Yeah.
think that would work given our 100 years of conflict with one another?
So let's pretend for a moment that you and I actually have power. Like you and I are actually important. We're not just two bald guys having a chat on YouTube. Um, if if I were to give a path forward, any path forward as a first step, not as a conclusion, as a first step, needs to begin with an unequivocal, unconditional apology and recognition of guilt on the part of the Zionists. It needs to begin with that. I am a Palestinian, but I am also a settler colonialist on another person's land. I'm not telling you that Canada does a great job at this. We're still learning. There are countries that do a much better job, like New Zealand. They're much better at this. But I need to recognize my status as a settler colonialist here. And despite the fact that my dad came here in the 70s and not the 1870s, right? And while my dad was not personally responsible in the ethnic cleansing of indigenous people, I benefit from the oppression of these people. Like my existence on this country exists on stolen resources. I need to recognize that, and Zionists need to recognize something similar. You have the difficult job of going and telling your people to apologize. I have the much more difficult job of telling my people to accept that apology because they don't have to. It's not reasonable to ask them to accept that apology. Asking a Palestinian to accept the apology of the Zionists and accept the path forward is like asking a rape victim to accept the apology of the rapist and then to engage in the arranged marriage thereafter. The rapist apologizing is not the difficult part. It's accepting the apology that's much more difficult because it's not a reasonable thing to ask. I'm not asking them to do something that is reasonable. But moving forward past that, once you could dismantle the institution of Jewish supremacy upon Palestinians, you could just begin, then you could start talking about federalist system, representation, blah, blah, blah. You could start talking about all of the details, right? How many Palestinians come back to each village, which villages they're going to live in, what the flag is going to look like. Do we pronounce hummus with a ha or a ha, or all of that becomes trivial relative to that initial first step, admission of guilt.
So I struggle seeing that as being a viable first step. It would need to come with like a greater package. It would need to come with some kind of a peace agreement. An admission of guilt, because again, an admission of guilt is laughable to most Israelis who just think that we've just been defending ourselves. We had every right to want to return home, and you didn't have a right to try to kill us, right? That's our narrative. So it's like, what the hell are we going to admit guilt for? I don't even know how you change the conversation on a national level for that to even be viable. I could see that happening at like stage 3 of reconciliation, after there's mutual recognition of one another, after we both have our own states. Like again, I'm not opposed to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just I don't see it being realistic for Israelis to ever get behind. And I think Israelis would also like um, an apology. And again, this is something that you hear me say this, you're like, yeah, Palestinians are never going to apologize. We're the victim. We're the victims
Mhm.
here. But when Israelis, think about their children and siblings and friends who were killed in terror attacks, they're like, well, I'm sorry you feel like you're oppressed. My daughter was blown up, and
Yeah.
I want an apology for that. So I wonder how we actually, if we only look at things through a power dynamic, what you're saying makes perfect sense. But people who benefit from power dynamics are no less human, and
Mhm.
they suffer no less from being victims of terror, from losing loved ones. So it's going to be very hard for them to not want something in reciprocation. So I'd li- I think it would need to go both ways, and I don't see it being step one without like a greater mutual recognition. So
Mhm.
it could be part of a peace agreement between our nations. Um,
Well, let me ask, because
mhm.
this is not unprecedented. So Americans went from enslaving Africans to not, right? Which was a much more severe power dynamic, right? And they went from literally categorizing these people as inhuman to not. Now, what was in between those things was a civil war. So I'm not telling you that this transition is painless, but there is a point where if this does not happen, if you have any formulation where this does not occur, the only outcome is subjugation of Palestinians in a Jewish supremacist state. Whatever you proceed with thereafter. This is why, like your incredulity at that possibility is because the Israeli state education system, Israeli municipalities, the state instruments of coercion, the entire apparatus of the state of Israel is founded in this bizarre world where the Zionist project, which was an inherently offensive action, is viewed as defensive, and Palestinian resistance, which is fundamentally defensive, is viewed as offensive. So let's look at like. By the way, I
But
said
but but
this.
again, so
Yeah.
I agree, but that doesn't take away from the people who have been victims of this
Yep.
conflict, right? So it's true what you're saying,
Well, Adar,
but
let's look at.
it's
Yeah.
just two
Go ahead.
things. On one level,
Mhm.
imagine what it would take for a nation in an instant to reverse their entire narrative. Right? I don't even think that, I think the only time something like this happens is after devastating defeat by another military. So, like, you could look at Nazi Germany, you look at Japanese imperialists, right? They went, their ideology, their national story changed very quickly, but that took destroying their countries, like total, like an atomic bomb being dropped on Japan is what it took for that to happen. For it to happen in a more organic method, which again, the idea of Israel being destroyed by another military doesn't seem like it's going to happen. We are strong. It's true. It's true. We're scared. We don't know what the future holds, but um, we are a very strong military, especially for this region. For it to happen organically, what actually needs to happen for an entire national narrative to shift? Either de- destroying that country or a more organic process in which we slowly understand our role in each other's grievances. So that's why I'm hesitant towards the starting point of a recognition of guilt, because I don't see that happening. Um, and also, it that does not take away from the fact that there are Jewish victims here, right? Like, so someone said, look how peaceful my surroundings is. That's true. I live a relatively good life. I'm not reminded of the conflict on a day-to-day basis. The reason I do this is because I don't want my security to be at the expense of another group of people. I don't want my liberty to be at, at the expense of Palestinian well-being. But I'm not victimized day to day. That being said, I've lost 5 friends to war and terror. Um, and obviously that takes a toll on me. Obviously that hurts. Um, and I'm just one person, but there's not a single Israeli who hasn't lost a loved one to war or terror. So I don't see it being entirely one-sided in the recognition, because we have been victimized as well by this conflict. Again, we could have a conversation who's been victimized more. We're going to be in full agreement there, but it doesn't take away from somebody who lost a loved one and how they feel.
Yeah, I don't have a painless answer for you. Like, I wish I could tell you, look, the solution is the way that you do this painlessly is by reforming the Israeli education system to include Palestinian voices to blah, 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 right? I don't think that will happen. And I don't think that will happen because I think the nature of the Israeli state is, as I've said numerous times throughout this whole conversation, right? The nature of the Israeli state is fundamentally Jewish supremacist and Jewish chauvinist. So that will not happen. And so that is why we have now made full circle. That is why I have a problem with normalization. I know the conclusion that I want to get to. And I know the only conclusion that I want to get to, and the only viable path forward, starts with a recognition of guilt. But to get there, Israel has to transform. Transform so much that it ceases to be nearly everything that it is. Now, whether that is done willingly, like the whites in South Africa, and by I mean willingly is an abuse of that word, right? The whites in South Africa faced enormous international pressure, enormous resistance, armed resistance, a boycott campaign, blah, 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 blah. They faced all of that before they finally said, this project is no longer viable. What's happening now, right now, is precisely the opposite in Israel, which is the right wing, and by right wing, I'm using Israeli terms of right and left, right? So what you recognize as the right wing is emboldened by the international community because they engage in further settlement expansion. They engage in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian neighborhoods. They are destroying homes in Silwan as we speak right now, and they are not punished for it. And so there needs to be a concerted effort of resistance, of anti-normalization, to force Israel at the point where it looks in the mirror and says, is there something, like, if everyone in the world agrees, whether they support Palestinians or not, actively or passively, if everyone in the world can see this situation for what it is and we can't, should we do some soul searching? Is there something wrong with the way that we've treated these people? That's the most, what's the nature of Palestinian resistance right now is the most painless way to bring global Jewry to that conclusion. A much more, like, if I was you, you and I have agreed, okay, khalas, you got to take this message to your people. The message as I see it would look like this. Right? We in the 1880s, we were victims of pogroms, the likes of which you cannot even imagine. Okay? We were subjected to insane levels of violence that were so severe that we got on a boat and sailed to a land that we read about in a book that we don't believe in, because most of them were atheists. We read about in a book that we don't believe in, but we got on a boat to escape. And when we escaped, we had very little trust of anyone around us. And that persisted for decades. And we made serious mistakes that resulted in the ethnic cleansing and the dispossession of the people from this land. And for that, we apologize. However, as the stronger party, if you do not want to engage with us, then the status quo will continue. And not only that, but we have the ability to further ethnically cleanse, whatever. As a weaker party, should you try to do to us what we did to you, which you may feel is morally or ethically justified, you will end up looking at yourselves in the mirror and seeing what we see in the mirror today. Each one of you will uproot a family and will destroy a life the same way that we have, and you will have a reckoning 100 years from now, dealing with the pain of that. Now, whether that message will resonate with anyone on your side of the fence, I don't know. I can't say. But I don't have a painless mechanism to get you there.
So again, this comes down to, there's a lot we really see eye to eye to, I think, but
Yeah.
and I think we ultimately we want the same goal here. We want to see all the people from the river to the sea free on this land. I think when it comes to approach is really where we view things differently. And you know, I'm coming from a vantage point. I understand Israelis and the Israeli mentality way better than you, and you understand Palestinians and the
Right.
Palestinian mentality way better than I do. So neither of us see the whole picture. We're going to need another 2 hours to
Right.
to dish this one out.
I don't know
just
if your comment section is usually this aggressive. I
so
don't usually pay
well,
attention.
we do have a half hour left. The reason I'm not going to give like a long rebuttal now is because I do want us to have time for audience questions, because I see audience is feisty, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I just want to reemphasize just one final point, that I very much think the fastest way to Palestinian liberation is allowing Jews on this land to feel safe. This seems contradictory to many forms of resistance, but it seems like the more scared we are, the less we care about Palestinians or their national aspirations.
Yeah.
Again, I'm really just summarizing how I see it. I know you fundamentally disagree with this approach. We could find more time to try to work out our differences here, but I think Jews need to feel safe. The more safe we feel, the more free Palestinians will be. Now, I could give you the final. You could take the final word on this. Just try to keep it short, and then I do want to go to audience questions.
You know, the last thing that I wanted to say has almost nothing to do with what I've already said, which is that I have 2 children. I have 2 young children. Anyone who leaves this conversation thinking that I enjoy the prospect of any family being ripped apart, of like any color in any part of the world, is a crazy person. Like, I don't read headlines of some kid in Sderot riding on his bike being hit by a Qassam rocket. I don't enjoy that. I don't like hearing that. It doesn't make me proud. It doesn't make me happy. I don't celebrate that. Like, I have enough humanity to be able to see that. What I am talking about is what I think are the few options of a path forward. But anyone who thinks I take any joy in, you know, I'm just responding to some of the vitriol that I'm seeing, you're out of your mind. But off to some questions.
Cool. Off to questions. Now, a little bit about some of the critique, just a more general overview. So you've said a lot of things that are inflammatory to Israelis, and I didn't jump right in and push back.
Yeah.
And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, I just don't get triggered by criticism. If you were to say something that I viewed as blatantly false, I'd correct you, but a lot of it comes down to terminology and uses of words. I'm comfortable with who I am. I'm comfortable with who my country is in terms of, I know Israel for good and for bad. I love Israel, yet I see her as highly flawed, and I'm dedicated to making Israel a better place. So you know, when people critique Israel, all good. You know,
Yeah.
the more you come to terms with who you are and who your nation is, the less offended you are by criticism. So if people in the chat are upset that I didn't push back on terms like Jewish supremacy, or stuff like that, it's because I am in no way offended when Bassam uses these terminologies, and I know exactly what he means by it. When he says settler colonialism, he's not saying, and again, I'm speaking for you, but just you could correct me if you think I'm wrong. When Bassam says settler colonialism, he's not saying we don't have connection to this land. He's not saying we don't belong to this land. He's saying the way we return to this land used settler
Was a
colonial.
settler colonial
Yeah,
project. Yes.
exactly. When he
Yes.
says Jewish supremacy, he's not saying that means we are going to have Palestinian slaves. He's just saying the nature of the state is Jewish. Jews will have priority and privilege over other groups of people. You
Which
can
is a
call that
problem, but yes. Yeah.
right. This is what Bassam means by the term. So no, I'm not going to get all worked up over it. I'd rather focus on the gist of the conversation, not inflammatory rhetoric that I don't find personally inflammatory. So just keep that in mind, chat. Again, the more you come to terms with who you are and who your nation is, the easier critique becomes. So we're going to start taking questions. Bassam, if you see something in the chat that you want to respond to, let me know. I'll pull it up. We'll prioritize super chats, of course, if anybody wants to toss a super chat. I saw that Shai, you did a super chat earlier. I can't pull it up now, but just re-ask the question, not in a super chat. I'll read it. And Iran, I saw that you were also upset by me not pushing back on certain things. If you want, you can make the case now of things that you think Bassam said that was wrong. We could ask him about those. And when you asked if I'm comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, no, not at all. Like just using an example of a different country to paint a picture does not mean you're saying that country is like this country. This is something people so often mistake when people use examples. Just because you use an example, you're just trying to find a parallel, one instance in which it's the same. It's not saying Israel's Nazi Germany. So, you know, don't take examples as like a literal comparison. Rajia, £5. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bassam. We are in pro-Palestinian movement and not jumping for joy when we hear that innocent Israelis are harmed. Thanks, Rajia. Nicholas goes, Bassam, would you accept apology for Nakba Naksa occupation, but not apology for Zionism? I can give you the first three, but not the last one. It's just impossible for me. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for the question, Nicholas. I think that's an interesting one.
Question. What a great question. Nicholas, I suppose that's how you define Zionism. If you interpret Zionism, look, the whole idea of Zionism and Jewish supremacy is something that was a pretty constant Zionist belief from the official formulation of Zionism in the 1890s onward. If your vision of Zionism is more about if your vision of Zionism is more about a return to a place that Jews feel that they have an ancestral connection and to live alongside and with the indigenous population, fine, but that is a unique and admittedly minority position of what Zionism ever was. So oftentimes in conversations like this, you end up with a lot of subjectivity, right? Of someone saying, no, that's not Zionism to me. Zionism to Peter Baynard did this when he was speaking with Yehuda. And I'm not saying that Peter Baynard is lying. He's just redefined his Zionism to mean something else. So if you have an interpretation of Zionism that is more about Hebrew restoration, that is more about the Jewish national movement, of bringing the Jews of the world under a single umbrella of a single nation, those aren't really things that have a whole lot to do with me. I don't know if I don't know if I've answered your question, but it really depends on how you're defining Zionism.
Cool. Thank you. I think that was an very good question and a good response. I think really what most people mean by Zionism is recognizing why we, A, belong to this land, why we felt the need to come back, and why we, and I guess this is probably the version of Zionism you're going to have trouble accepting, but why we feel the need to have a demographic majority on this land, because it's the only thing that ensures our security. So I imagine the last part you're not going to be able to get on board with, but the other aspects of Zionism, like the fact that we have a right to return, the fact that we have a right to self-determination on our ancestral homeland, that's the Zionism that you can get behind, correct?
So, sorry, ask that last part again.
So the aspect of Zionism that I think you and many Palestinians can certainly get behind is the idea that Jews have a right to live on this land, that we're of this land, that we have a right to self-determine on this land. The part of Zionism that most Palestinians greatly struggle with is the idea of having certain preference or priority towards Jews on a certain piece of land. That's something that most Palestinians probably won't be able to get on board with. But the idea of Jews self-determining on this land and recognizing that Jews are from this land is something that it seems most Palestinians can get on board with.
Not only can they get on board with, but they were on board with for 1,400 years, like for as long as look, the identity of Palestinians is something we didn't really talk about a whole lot in this conversation. And I'm not going to go on another rant because I know that we're trying to rapid fire through some questions. Needless to say, again, that there were already indigenous mechanisms to deal with influxes of Circassians and Kurds and Armenians and Turks and other peoples who were not necessarily Muslim either, other peoples who just melted into the society, because indigeneity was something that was, diversity was something that was indigenous to Palestine. And so had the Zionists gone about things differently, history would have played out very differently, in my estimation.
Cool. Let's see what else we got. You see anything you want to? So I feel like you spoke on this, but I see Nomto's asking it repeatedly. So maybe you want to give a short explanation for why you think the apology should only be one-sided.
Yeah. In what other world does the indigenous population apologize for resisting settler colonialism? Like, do we ask, like, in where else? This to me is nonsensical. Now, I understand on an individual level, somebody saying, my child was hit by a rocket and I've had to suffer with it. I get that. But now let me ask you, today, at least publicly, right? Who do the Germans blame for the Second World War?
Who does who blame?
Who do the Germans blame for the Second World War?
I don't know, the Jews?
So look, at least officially, and to the when I was doing my master's, my learning partner was a German woman, brilliant woman, and she told me kind of repeatedly about the hatred that they have for the Nazis, that they are brought up hating the Nazis and what the Nazis have done.
Oh, you mean Germans today?
Germans today, yes.
Okay, yeah.
I am not making a direct equivalent between the Jews and the Zionists and the Nazis. And okay, just get over it and let me make the rest of my point. But who dropped the bombs on Berlin and Munich? Who dropped America,
Russia,
the
England,
Royal
yeah.
Air Force, the Soviet Union, whoever. But who do they hold responsible for that? They hold the Nazis responsible for it. The resistance is a response to something. It is a response to Israeli colonization. Without Israeli colonization, without Jewish supremacy, without the Zionist project manifesting in the way that it did, you would not have this. Do I expect you to be on board with it? Do I expect that? I could tell you what I believe to be true. I can't make it palatable. I can't make it drinkable for you. Doesn't mean it's not going to be bitter going down.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's so Noam, I know you're not pleased with that response, but this isn't viewed as a war. This is viewed as one side dominating the other. Why should the oppressed group apologize for what? For defending themselves? So that's that's a narrative that to an extent resonates with me. I don't. Again, we discussed our disagreements here as to the likelihood of it happening and what needs to happen before an apology happens. But I definitely understand and accept your perspective on this.
Look, there's a recurring question that keeps coming up about the Grand Mufti, and I'll address this very quickly to what's his name, the Church of Delicious Meat. It's hard to take you seriously, buddy, with a name like that. Look, the Grand Mufti was not evil. He was stupid. Okay. He was an inept and conniving and manipulative man who inherited a very, very important position from a very, very notable family. And he made repeated poor decisions in his leadership and is largely, funny. If you ask the average Palestinian about Hajj Amin al-Husseini, I don't want to say most, many Palestinians have no idea who he is and relegated to the pages of history. Not because they're embarrassed by him, as maybe the assumption that you'd come to, but because he was ineffectual. He didn't do much. He did not do much that in the position that he had, he was not good at what he was doing. So if you want to sit here and beat the Grand Mufti, you're pushing against an open door. Like I have nothing to say about him.
Do you think that Jews are indigenous to this land?
Your identity is a story that you tell about yourself. The most important thing about your identity is not about DNA. It's about the story. That's what brings you together. Identity is a kind of it's a social construct. And the story of the Jews is indigenous to this land. The story of the Jews is indigenous to Palestine. Take all of the Khazar conversion, blah, blah, blah. I don't care about any of that. Like you could be a Jew whose ancestors never set foot in Palestine, and the land may still resonate with you.
Would you feel the same if a Canadian indigenous tribe was kicked out of Canada a few hundred years ago and they eventually were able to return? Like at what point does a group of people lose their indigeneity?
This is a great what's his name, Hillel Cohen, in a book Year Zero. I think his name is Hillel Cohen. Year Zero of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a list of questions that I have that I kind of call the questions before the conversation. And this is one of those questions of what does it mean to be a settler colonialist? What does it mean to be indigenous? And does indigeneity expire? So with the few minutes that we have remaining, let's look into some of this. A lot of the people in your chat are exploding because they're saying, how could we be settler colonialists when we are indigenous? And my rebuttal to that is, why do you think those two things are mutually exclusive? Imagine this.
Correct.
White America, to where are they indigenous? To Europe. White America, Irish America, Italian America, Greek America, Americans who consider themselves white, they're indigenous to Europe. If America were to go now set up military bases, settlements, extraction of resource projects, whatever it is, in Europe, would that be a colonial project? The answer is resoundingly yes. If the Phoenicians in Carthage, in ancient Carthage, went back and conquered what is modern-day Lebanon, would they have been colonialists after an absence of hundreds of years? Who, by the way, left as a persecuted people. By the way, Americans also left as a persecuted people. The Americans, the white Americans who left Europe, also left as a persecuted Christian community. If they were to come back and colonize the place that they were ancestrally from, that would be colonization. If the Phoenicians did that, that would be colonization. Adar, are you a fan of science fiction?
Yeah.
Okay, so I read a ton of fantasy and science fiction, and like a very common trope in modern sci-fi is the colonization of space, right? So I want to ask you a hypothetical. Imagine if a group of Earthlings, right, were exiled to Mars, and 3,000 years later, they came back to Earth. Are they Martians or are they Earthlings?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the way I like to understand Zionism is an indigenous rights movement that used settler colonial tactics to achieve their goals. That seems to be a perfectly legitimate way to have both these ideas coexist. I think, again, it's going to take time for many Israelis to acknowledge the settler colonial methods that were enacted, but I think that framing is one that works. It recognizes that we are from this land. We are a people who returned to this land after thousands of years of yearning. Our prayers, we pray towards Jerusalem. We talk about next year in Jerusalem. It just wasn't viable. It took a few desperate and ambitious people to make it happen against all odds, but it was deep down in ambition for a long time. So I think the recognition that we're of this land and that we have a right to be from this land, while recognizing that in order to return, we did use settler colonial methods that are not justified. I think that's a perfectly acceptable way to frame who we are and how we returned.
You go ahead and pick something. I think we've probably got time for one more question.
Sure. Well, another thing, because I did see this charge against you. You used the rapist. Again, it's just taking an analogy too literally. You said it would be like asking for an apology from the person who. I don't remember exactly how you used it, but you did.
It would be like you would be the one demanding that the rapist apologize. I would be the one asking the rape victim to accept the apology and the arranged marriage thereafter. And I own that and I stand by it.
Right. So people were offended by that because they don't like to. They don't. Yeah. Because a rape.
Adar,
Well,
can I say
well. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Nobody wants to believe that they are the antagonist in anybody's story. You are all the protagonists in your own story, and there are extras and antagonists around. And what I'm asking you to do is to reflect on the fact that you are very much the antagonist in somebody else's story. By the way, a real rapist, he's somebody's son, right? He's got parents that love him. He's a protagonist in somebody, like a real rapist in real life, right? He's a protagonist to somebody. He's a protagonist in his own view. So your offense by this is fine, okay. But nobody ever is comfortable with the idea of viewing themselves as the antagonist in anybody else's story. Do you think I like thinking about the Muslims as the antagonist to the Armenians in Anatolia? I take pride in the fact that Armenians were able to come to Palestine among Palestinian Muslims and make themselves at home. This is what helps me sleep at night. with everything that happened to the Armenians, what helps me sleep at night is to know that when they reached Palestine, they were at home, that they were treated well. And the collective memory of the Armenians honors that. They honor that reality. But
Right.
I need to reflect on the fact that I could be the bad guy in somebody else's story, and it may be justified.
So again, I hear you. I think it's an analogy that works to prove a point, but I'm gonna shine light on why it's offensive. Because for two reasons. First of all, rape is one of the most malicious acts anybody can do. So much of what we do that harms Palestinians is not with the intention of harming Palestinians. It's with the intention of self-preservation. So intention matters. So the intention is vastly different. And it's true that rape, I don't think when a rapist, their intention is to harm someone, it's for their own
It's
sexual
for their own
desire.
satisfaction.
It's
Yes,
for
I
their
was
own
going to
satisfaction.
say, yeah.
Right. But there's a difference between brutally harming somebody for your own satisfaction and doing it because you feel you need to survive. So that's one huge difference, intention. The other is that most Israelis, despite on a state level, the power imbalance, most Israelis are not guilty of harming Palestinians. They're just Israelis that are trying to live their lives. You could say they're guilty for not doing more to liberate Palestinians, but it's hard to expect somebody to dedicate their life to someone who they view as their enemy. So,
I
right.
would,
So
I would,
those two things, intention, and
yeah,
because individuals don't want to be compared to rapists when they're just trying to live their lives, it's going to be an inflammatory statement. I understood what you meant by it, but
yeah,
I'm trying to explain
yeah.
why it was inflammatory for so many people.
We imagine colonialists, like when I say settler colonialists, I think most of the people in the chat imagine a British guy in a top hat with an Indian under his boot and like a Kenyan around his fist, right? Like in a vice grip. Do you think the French in Algeria felt like colonialists? You don't feel. I don't feel like a colonizer right now in my basement, sitting here and having this nice conversation with you. You don't feel like a colonizer right now, right? You're not. You don't feel like you're actively engaged in colonialism, but I
Right.
am, and you are. This is what for 99% of people, this is what colonialism actually looks like. Palestinians often, we used to use the analogy, not used to, we still use the analogy as a rhetorical device. If somebody says, like, explain to me what's happening in Palestine, and we say, like, imagine you have a house and somebody comes into your house and says, I used to live here, and then now they won't leave, but then you go to the courts and the courts say, well, it's actually his house and blah, 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 right? Have you heard this kind of rhetorical device before? And Zionists used to say, well, that's a stupid analogy. That's not really exactly how this works. Things like that never happen. And lo and behold, Allah sends us Yaakov into the home of the Kurd family to like literally live out that analogy, almost like in a play-by-play. Analogies are just meant to drive a point. You don't want to get lost in the forest and say, well, it's not exactly like rape. It's more like, okay, fine. It's like asking the mother of a murdered child to accept the murderer's apology. Whatever, right? You want to use something other than rape? Okay, but it doesn't diminish from the point of the analogy.
Right. I agree with you there. The one thing I will say is that it depends which audience we want to reach. So certain analogies, that's an analogy that's going to very much speak to a Palestinian audience. But if you're trying to reach the hearts and minds of Israelis, then probably a different analogy should be used. This is something that I'm constantly, and again, I used the Holocaust analogy before, and it triggered Jews in the chat, and I understand why. So this is something that I'm constantly thinking about and constantly trying to work on. It's how can we convey a message, right? Our audience is very mixed. We have people from all over. How can we convey a message that both sides can hear when naturally, the more you fit your message for one group, the less it's going to be palatable for another group. So it's very hard finding that middle ground, and and understanding what the right use of words is, and how to best change the hearts and minds of the people you want to reach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you got
noted.
Yeah. Again, you like just to build on that, you very much you probably haven't spoken to many Israelis, right? The majority of the people you've spoken to have been other Palestinians or Westerners about Palestine, right? Is that fair to say?
My exposure, my firsthand exposure to Zionists was all on university campus, and they were all of the Likud variety. They, by and large, they were. It was interesting. Good times. I was also a different person back then, but maybe they've grown up.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I know you do. I know you need a run. I'll stay on a little bit longer, take some audience questions, chat a little bit. But Bassam, you wanna have a final thought?
Um, I do want to see a world that minimizes suffering. Period. I I'm a generally pretty emotional person. Like I don't like to see I don't like to see people hurt. Um, what I'm saying here and everything that I've said, I've given a lot of thought. Uh, I I've given it enough thought to know that I know what conclusion we need to come to in order for Palestinian liberation to be a thing, for real Palestinian liberation to take place. And I don't have any easy answers for anyone who is invested in the settler colonial project remaining exactly how it is. Sorry, guys.
It's been great having you, Bassam. Very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Adar.
I just in general, I appreciate whatever we've developed here these past few months. Maybe friendship is too much of a normalizer term, but I do consider you a friend, and
Listen,
I've
Adar, I will say in no uncertain terms. Look, the reason why all of my actual friends, okay, not my Instagram followers, but like my actual friends, all said, really, you're doing this? Because they all know I don't debate. I don't do debates. I haven't debated since university. It's not my thing. I can have conversations. But Adar, I know enough about you. I know enough about, and the first thing I ever said to you was that I believe that you're genuine in what you say. And I mean that. So I would not have had this conversation almost with anyone else. Because it's not really, like I told you, I'm much more interested in the project of truth than I am in the project of reconciliation. I believe that you're sincere in conveying a message of Palestinian liberation. I believe that you're sincere in not wanting to see Palestinians oppressed in their indigenous homeland. And I can assure you that if you ever came to Vancouver, that you're welcome in my house for dinner. And that's something I only offer friends. How's that?
I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that, and I'd love to have you on again at some point. I'm sure I'm going to get outreach from a bunch of people who want to debate you. So,
not interested. Not interested. Not for sale.
Cool, Bassam. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
All right. See you guys.
So, friends, you can find Bassam's contact information in the description if you want to get in touch with him, if you want to find out about his podcast. Wow, now that my screen's big, I could see. Honestly, this is a good background we got. I'm in Herzliya right now. It was a little bit hot earlier. My brain was I was being fried, but now it's like comfortable, cool, good lighting. So I'll be doing more debates from this location. I'll just make sure they start at 8 and not at 6. You may have seen that once in a while I would turn my camera off, and that was just so I could wipe my face. Felt like I shouldn't do that on camera. Anyways, let's debrief. Let's talk, because I know that that was a session that there was a lot of things that were triggering. Emotions were running high. Let's really talk about it. I did see one or two questions. So Ben asks, Adar, do you think Bassam was actively trying to find common ground? His remarks were very pointed, and I can't see culture changing to bend to his idea of what is needed. So there's no doubt that Bassam wanted to share his perspective and his message. You know, this is an opportunity for him to do so. That said, I do think that he heard me. He listened to what I said. He might not agree, but some of our disagreements he may reflect on. Very, and this is going to be true with any debate, any discussion between two people from opposing sides. It's very hard to change your mind on the spot. It's possible Bassam said something that's going to change my perspective. It's possible I said something that's going to change his perspective. But it's going to take a few days, weeks, or even years for that for us to understand what changed through this conversation. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see. What else do we got here? Super chats will obviously be prioritized, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Trotsky or Bust says this wasn't a debate. It was a conversation, but I don't know. If you watch from the beginning, you'll see there's like 3, 4, maybe 5 fundamental differences between us. He shared something, I explained theirs, I disagree. He shared why he disagreed. I mean, we're not going to yell and curse and be mean to one another if that's what you're looking for. But you know that already if you follow this channel. Nir, thanks for the question. Adar, do you think Arab nations should take responsibility for the Palestinian suffering in their territories? For sure, yeah. I think governments are responsible for the people they govern, and if Palestinians aren't being treated well in countries they live in, for sure that's the responsibility of the countries. Mm-hmm. Johan goes, Adar, you mentioned that in order for Palestinians to be free, Israelis need to feel safe, which we all agree with, but doesn't that depend specifically on how Palestinians are treated? Johan, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Doesn't that depend specifically on how Palestinians are treated? I don't know. Can you try to reword it? It might be I've been sitting in the sun for too long, but I'm not fully understanding what you're saying. Noam goes, Bassam said that Arab governments should not take responsibility, so why didn't you say anything? He didn't say Arab countries should not take responsibility. When asked that question, he focused specifically on Israelis and Palestinians, and he said that he doesn't think the colonized population should take responsibility for their resistance methods. This isn't even a radical opinion. Like, guys, we need to understand. We need to understand how we're viewed to Palestinians and why we're viewed that way. If we were in Palestinian shoes, we would view it very similar to them. Okay. For Palestinians living on the land, the way they viewed Zionists was Europeans showing up one day with the intention to carve out a Jewish homeland, not a binational homeland, a Jewish homeland. They had associations and trusts called Jewish Colonial Association, right? We called ourselves colonizers. We didn't speak the same language. We didn't look the same way. We didn't wear the same clothes. We didn't treat them with respect. This is how Palestinians experienced us coming to the land. They rejected us carving out a Jewish homeland. It's not hard to understand why. We were not so friendly to people who showed up. We weren't friendly to the Romans. We weren't friendly to anybody else who showed up on our doorstep. And if your natural inclination is to say, yeah, but that's different because we're indigenous and Romans aren't, yeah, but how can you expect, do you really expect Palestinians living here in the 1800s to see Europeans show up, not treating them with respect, calling themselves colonizers, and then saying, you know what, but because they're indigenous, we'll let them have it? Like, come on, let's have realistic expectations. Like, we often say that the world holds us to the highest standard. And to an extent, I agree that we get a disproportionate amount of attention, but the standard that we hold Palestinians to, we would have acted exactly the same. The way we treated outsiders who tried to conquer this land, we responded with violence. So it's almost like for us to, for when you ask Bassam, shouldn't Palestinians apologize? That's like asking us, shouldn't we apologize to resisting against the Romans? And again, you're going to try to look for small differences as why it's different. It's similar enough. The way we experience the Romans is very similar to how they experience us. And obviously, you're not going to expect us to apologize to the Romans for resisting. So that's how it's viewed for Palestinians. And that might make you uncomfortable, but if we have any hope at reconciling, we need to understand this. And in understanding this, we're better positioned to share with Palestinians who we are, our struggle, our grievances, our history on this land. I saw a super chat. You should have someone from Balad and hear their vision of a solution. I think Azmi Bishara ideas are very important. Shai, thanks for the 15 shekels. And I did not get to ask Bassam your other question, but I can ask him that in DM. So thank you, Shai. And yeah, I'd be happy if you have. So Azmi Bishara, sure, yeah, I'm down to do that. Rima goes, I think a lot of people have connection to this country. It's not one person over another. Maybe this mentality is the issue. Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of the problems we have come from wanting exclusive ownership rather than shared ownership. That being said, I do understand why each population wants their own sovereignty, especially after so much conflict. So I think we need to find a way to share, but I don't think it's wrong to ask for each people to be sovereign over a part of the land. So Adi, again, this is you're saying, but the Romans had no good reason to sit with us for conversation and justify the conquest of the land. We do have. So again, you're trying to point to differences, but that difference between us and the Romans, it's true. We're not Romans. We're an indigenous people returning again. But to expect Palestinians to accept that, it's not that we just returned to live. We returned calling ourselves colonizers, buying land and kicking inhabitants out of their homes, wanting an exclusive Jewish state, treating the natives with disrespect. So again, to think that those people should just think to themselves, but you know what, they're indigenous, so we're just going to let them kick us off our land and have an exclusive Jewish home. That's not a realistic expectation, and we wouldn't have accepted that if the roles were reversed. Let's see. Adi, Adar, 70 years have passed. Why can they not accept it now? So I think this is a legit question. This is a lot of my focus comes down to this, that's saying like, I recognize why we were not accepted, but I think now Palestinians need to accept that Israel is here to stay. I still understand why they don't. Where in many ways their mortal enemy, but the continuous rejection of Israel is only harming Palestinian liberation. So um, as well as it's harming us, right? It's why we are in a continued state of conflict. And it's why, as much as we can focus on a power dynamic, but it's not even clear there's many things Israel could do to improve the situation. There's a lot of good faith measures we could take tomorrow. There's a lot of policy implementation we could do to improve the lives of Palestinians. But there's no clear path that Israel can take to actually achieve peace on this land that wouldn't put Jews in danger. So the whole expectation that Israel has the power and Israel should be the ones to do it, it's true. I believe Israel does have the power and should do a lot more, but it's not that simple. It's not like we have the keys and we just refuse to do it. And that's something that people who who hate Israel or dislike Israel need to come to terms with. Most people who are most critical of Israel can't even tell Israel what solution they can take to solve the conflict that's not going to put Jews in danger. So Nir, thanks. Ben-Gurion didn't want an exclusive Jewish state. So when I say exclusive, I don't mean no Palestinians allowed. We recognized we needed a demographic majority. We wanted the character, the symbols, the institutions to be Jewish. Ben-Gurion, I think, at one point said we could have up to 15% Palestinian population. So it's not about a state with no Palestinians whatsoever. It's just about it being a Jewish state that prioritizes Jews over the Palestinians living here. It's like, again, it's not hard to understand why they didn't accept that. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so Mossad, you go, when you buy land, you get the land. Yeah, so this is such a common, like, Hasbara talking point that if you were to understand the history of how that land was purchased, then you'd understand that this is just a bad argument. These arguments are why one of the reasons we do so bad in PR. Land ownership in the Middle East didn't exist in the forms of having a lease over a property. It was communally owned. Villages owned the land they lived on. They farmed it together. That's how it worked. That's how it worked for thousands of years in this region. In the 1850s, Palestinians, the Ottoman Empire began a process called, I believe it was the Tanzimat, it was called. It was to try to I don't know. I don't remember the exact goals, but it was to nationalize, create stronger. Wait, hold on. I don't want to get it wrong, but the Tanzimat reorganization. That's what it means. It's the reorganization was a period of reform in the Ottoman Empire that began in 1839 and ended with the first constitutional era in 1876. So learn about the Tanzimat. But essentially, during this time, the Ottoman Empire said that all landowners, all Muslim landowners actually, need to register their land. So in time of war, we can call your sons to fight. Okay? So a few things happened. Many Palestinians did not want to send their sons to fight for the Ottomans. They didn't see themselves as part of the Ottoman Empire. They needed their sons to stay and farm the land, be part of the family. So they made deals with rich Ottoman Christians from Beirut, for example, rich members of the Ottoman Empire, that they would register the land under their name, and then the inhabitants of that land would just pay rent. That was one instance that occurred. Another one was simply that the landowners the Farahim, the Palestinian farmers, didn't even know about land registry or how it worked. And through bureaucratic manipulation, rich Ottomans just took control over that land and started demanding rent. That's how the land got owned by the people that the early Zionists bought it from. So for our framing to just be like, yeah, but we bought the land, so of course we could kick off its inhabitants. If you don't recognize that as an injustice, and if you and if your explanation is, yeah, but it was legal, you're convincing nobody. This is exactly the reason why we do so bad in PR, because we make horrible arguments. They're making a strong moral claim, and you're making a flimsy legal argument. We know that law does not equal morality. So again, Masad, when you say when you buy the land, you get the land, you got to understand more context to understand why it's not that simple. So Masad, you say you already know about this. Thanks for that education. Well, if you know about this, why do you make such dumb arguments? Like, come on. If you know about this, you should be making better arguments. Near, you thought this was a Zoom background? No, this is in Herzliya. So interesting thing, Herzliya was named after Theodor Herzl. That's the city I'm in right now. Beautiful place, the marina here. Let's see. So Ben goes, Adar, do you think Bassam calling Jewish history in Israel a story is emblematic of the conflict? No, I think he says that a people in identity, I don't remember the exact wording used, but he holds that true about Palestinians as well. He says Palestinian identity is dependent on their national story. So that wasn't something that he was saying was exclusive to Jews, at least from what I understood. Adar, thanks, Nir. Do you think Bassam had a condescending approach in this conversation? No, I don't think he came off as condescending. I think he came off as hard on Israel, and I think he used language that's inflammatory for Israelis and Jews. I wasn't feeling a condescending tone. No. But I do understand why his rhetoric was inflammatory to many people. Yeah. Let's see what else. Palestine Ball, what's up? What did Bassam mean by Jewish supremacy? He meant a state that prioritizes and prefers Jews. So, for example, put aside that like our symbolism is Jewish, our national anthem is Jewish, our institutions are Jewish, but let's talk more practical, like actual law. First of all, he shared a very interesting article about neighborhood expansion and how it's much easier, how Jewish neighborhoods are much more likely to get permits to expand their neighborhoods than Arab neighborhoods. I could link that in the description if people are interested. But let's just talk about something simpler. Any Jew in the world can move to Israel, and I will even get money for moving to Israel, right? Palestinians who lived here 73 years ago, their offspring cannot. They cannot move to Israel. There's nothing they can do to return. So, there's an obvious prioritization of Jews. Can I understand why that is? Yeah, sure. We need demographic majority, in order for us to stay safe. but that, that is preferring Jews. So that's what's considered Jewish supremacy. People get triggered by Jewish supremacy because I think they think of it as like having like Palestinian slaves or I don't know, separate water fountains, but this supremacy can manifest itself in many ways. Church of Delicious Meat asks, how much cash do you get to move to Israel? So I think it always changes, but the government gives you, you get government funds for like your first year or 2 years, like a few $100s a month. And then there's different organizations that will pay you depending on where you come from. So North Americans, there's an organization called Nefesh B'Nefesh. I got $4,000 when I made Aliyah in 2008 by Nefesh B'Nefesh. But if I came from a different country, from like Russia or South America, I wouldn't have gotten it. So I don't know why they decide to give it to North Americans. But I mean, cool. I took it. Why not? We're light on super chats today, huh? And I always mention the super chat because obviously I like to I'd like to do this full time. I don't want to need to work a day job. I want to just do content and reconcile. So super chats help, but I recognize that not everyone can just be throwing money at a live streamer, and I fully accept that and recognize that. That's why we will always do our best to get to as many questions as possible, regardless of if they're super chats or not. Low Pro 94, thanks for the question. Adar, what do you think about organizations who organize face-to-face dialogue encounters? Are they helping to change or normalizing, perpetuating the status quo? Which ones are good in your opinion? No, I'm supportive of these. I think face-to-face encounters help. This is the stance. This is one of my major disagreements with Bassam, is that I see face-to-face encounters as a very effective way in order to progress, solving the conflict. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it can help. So I don't think it perpetuates the status quo. I think the more Israelis and Palestinians trust each other, the more we know about each other's narratives and grievances, I think the better off we're gonna be to finding a viable solution. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Oh, and you asked which are good. So there's Minds of Peace, which is an awesome organization. There's Seeds of Peace, Women Wage Peace, Combatants for Peace. Hey, they all have the word peace in them. That's interesting. Adi goes, thanks for the 15 shekels, Adi. I think this discussion was not respectful enough. Unfortunately, I have only 150 letters, so it's hard for me to explain why. Really? Do they only, is there a character limit on these comments? Interesting. Well, Adi, we could catch up later. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. Iran Pierre, thanks for the question. What do you think about equating Zionism with evil and then blaming all that evil, including police brutality in the USA, on the Zionists, almost the Zionists are the Jews? Yeah, so I mean, this is a good point. What we're seeing today is there's like a little loophole in how to criticize Jews. Just say the Zionists, right? So you could be critical of Zionism and Zionists, but the second you're starting to engage in rhetoric that says Zionists are responsible for the world problem, Zionists are responsible for 9/11, Zionist this, Zionist that's just a code for Jews. You're just saying Jews without explicitly saying Jews. And in general, when you make a disparaging comment about Zionists, you also need to understand that the vast majority of Jews are Zionists. It doesn't say much about how they view the Israel-Palestine conflict, what they feel about Palestinians. It simply means that they support Jewish self-determination, and you would expect people to support their own self-determination, generally speaking. So yeah, I agree with you, Ron. It's become like a code for the Jews that's just more acceptable. Al-Ram, thanks for the 15 shekels. Shares a Wikipedia link. This is when Arab nationalists and separatism started. Oh, cool. So everyone check that out. Thanks, Dash. Right? That's your name, Dash. Do I call myself a Zionist? So I support Jewish self-determination. So in that sense, yeah, I'm a Zionist. I think Jews should have the right to self-determine. I don't agree with any form of self-determination. So I don't support a system of inequality. I don't think the way Zionism has manifested itself the past 100+ years is a Zionism that I support. So again, I support Jewish self-determination. In that sense, I am a Zionist. Do I think that political Zionism, as it's manifested itself the past 100 years, I do not support that. Mossad corrects me that it's long dash. Okay, long dash. Oh, Dash is salam shalom from Discord. Okay, good to see you here, bro. Hoymin, thanks for the $8. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Adar, for your conversation and the effort to stay on afterwards. Have a beer on me. I appreciate that. I actually quit drinking nearly 2 years ago, so I won't have a beer, but maybe some other indulgent act in your name. No problem. Adar, do you think the left doesn't really understand Israel because a lot of stuff they say is not right? Yeah. The American left or just Western activists don't know shit. They know absolutely nothing about the conflict. They just know the taglines they need to know to sound virtuous on social media. No, most of them have a very, very shallow understanding of the conflict. It's just it's part of popular social justice movements. You make a tweet, you take a stance, you feel cool, you get positive reinforcement from your friends, and you go on about it. But no, most of these people don't know, and most of them, I don't even think they really care. I think it's just it's the cool thing to do to take a stance on this topic. That being said, I have nothing against with Western activists being involved. I'm just giving like an honest assessment of where I think their level of knowledge is. The average activist doesn't know much. Are some experts? For sure. There's many Western activists that have a much better understanding of the conflict than many Israelis or Palestinians. So we can't just paint them all with the same brush. Some genuinely are experts. The vast majority don't know anything. Near asked, do I think I have another home besides Israel? I mean, I'm an American citizen as well, but I don't see myself ever moving back here. My entire family's here. My mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my nieces, my grandparents, my cousins. And if you want to know which country I love more, I mean, it's Israel by far. So, I consider Israel my home. Again, will I live here till the day I die? Hard to say. Life's long. I love traveling, so I want to see as many different countries as possible, but I very much consider Israel to be my home. And a lot of my criticism of Israel comes because I'm dedicated to improving Israel. Like we get very defensive when people criticize us, or even when other Israelis or Jews criticize Israel. But I genuinely view this as part of being a patriot, is working to improve your country. If you love something, you work to improve it. This is true with the country you're part of. This is true with a friend or a sibling or a loved one. We work to elevate those we love. So it's the same for Israel. So, Bas ul Ulema, are you ashamed of what you support? How do you sleep at night knowing you live on someone else's land? Um, what is it that I should be ashamed of? That I should that I support both Jewish and Palestinian self-determination, that I want all the people on the land to be free? Should I be ashamed of the fact that it hurts me that Palestinians are suffering? Should I be ashamed of the fact that I genuinely want to make Israel better and want Palestinian liberation to actualize itself? What do you want me to be ashamed of? How do I sleep at night knowing I live on someone else's land? I live on my land. It's Palestinian land as well. It's ours to share. So no, I'm not living on somebody else's land. I'm living on a land I share with my Palestinian brothers and sisters. No shame in that. What else do we got? Oh, so you think I support genocide? Yeah, I don't. So good try with that, boss. Let's see. Yeah, Mossad, I see you open a channel called the Juminati. Seems pretty cool. If you can invite me on, I'll come chat with you all. I know we disagree on most things, but I'm all for respectful dialogue despite our disagreements. And I wish you the best of luck with that channel. Content is a long process, and it's commendable people who you know try to get into it. All right, I'm gonna do two more just because it's getting late. I want to have some dinner. Ben Ben asks, Adar, what do you think of U.S. sentiment toward Israel? Change in funding was no longer available. That Israel would be able to continue to exist. Yeah, I don't think Israel needs American funding. I think we'd be fine without it. Um, I think it might even be beneficial if we didn't have American funding. We might be better off ultimately. So I'm not concerned about that. I don't think we're going to lose American funding anytime soon. But if we did, it doesn't concern me. Low Pro 94 goes, Adar, there's an organization called Friendships Across Borders, FAB. They organize face-to-face dialogues with Israelis, Palestinians, Germans because of their related history. I went in 2019. Very cool. I will definitely look into that. FAB. Sounds fab. Let's see. Yeah, Church of Delicious Meat goes, the U.S. aid to Israel is less than 2.6% of Israel's GDP. Yeah, it's a small fraction. Exactly, and this is an important point. Hold on, not this. Nope, sorry, not this. Tenet GG, considering 75% of American funding goes right back into American military industry and is basically a tax racket, it won't end this century. Exactly. Like a lot of people view American aid to Israel as a result of AIPAC or other Jewish lobbies. They more likely than that, it's just the defense industry. They're a much bigger lobby than AIPAC. The defense industry has way more influence over U.S. foreign policy than the Jews. So, if you want to understand why America gives funding to Israel, it's because that money, 75%, needs to then be spent in American uh, defense companies. So it's just a subsidy for the American defense industry. Shai asks, thanks for the 15 shekels, Shai. Adar, do you think Israel can stay Jewish, democratic, isn't a problem because Arabs cannot be Jewish? Yeah, I, again, this is one of the challenges. If we have a right of return, I don't think we could have a right of return into Israel proper unless we have some sophisticated system of checks and balances, like a 50-50 split in governance that some federation plans propose. But if the demographics are 20% Palestinians and 80%, well, it's not 80% Jews, but let's say 70 plus percent Jewish, then it could be entirely democratic and equal. The only thing that wouldn't be equal would be immigration, which I understand why that's not acceptable for many Palestinians. Like I get that, but I think that could work. And you could call that Jewish supremacy, but I would be okay with a solution like that if Palestinians have their own state where there could be a right of return to that state. Like I would support a Jewish state having some preference to Jews if Palestinians have their own version of that. If they don't, then we need to find a different way to make it work. And it's not unique to have a country that prefers like the dominant population. Germany prefers Germans, France prefers French, Japanese prefer Japanese. The reason it's different here is because we created a homeland on a land with other inhabitants. So it's not fair if they're not equal to us, right? Like there's any place where it's unjust to give preference to the dominant group that lives there. It's on a land where there's other inhabitants who have been living here. So it makes it very tricky. I hope that answers your question, Shai. Okay, I'm gonna sign off. I want to have dinner. It was great, friends. Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, this was interesting. I know at times there were some emotionally arousing moments, but these conversations are going to be difficult. It's not easy, not for either side, to hear certain claims and arguments. Some guy, thanks for the €5 donation. I really appreciate it. With no message, thanks, some guy. Yeah, Shai, I get what you're saying. Shai goes and says, but Arabs can become Germans, they cannot become Jews. Correct. I use Germany as an example. Again, it comes down to not every example is going to be the same, but Germany has control over who becomes a citizen, who doesn't, who gets let in, who doesn't. I was just trying to express that sovereign nations do not treat all people the same. So it's just the concept of a nation having different rules for different people is not novel. It's not unique. It's the majority of nations are like that. Israel has a more difficult situation because we have natural inhabitants. It would be similar to in the United States, Native Americans not having the same status as Americans, right? That would just be unjust. So that's probably a more interesting parallel. America's not a good example because there's zero demographic concern. Americans aren't in danger of genocide, and I think Jews on this land, if we do not have control over some piece of land, I genuinely think the chance of us being in danger is high. I'm not a fearmonger. I'm not super paranoid, but there's not much reason to be confident in the idea that Jews being a minority on this land after 100 years of conflict, that we're just going to be safe. We need to understand this reality. If you want to understand what drives Israelis, what drives Zionism, you need to understand the concern the demographic concern. People call it racist. People call it Jewish supremacist. I get it. I understand why that's how it's viewed. But you need to understand Jewish fear on this land, and how us being a minority very much seems like it puts us at risk of genocide, and we're not going to allow that to happen. The sooner people accept that, the better off we are to find viable solutions to this conflict. And with that, signing off, friends. We'll have a few live streams next week. Much love, as always.